The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of molten zinc. It was August 1888, and the man who would one day change the New York skyline, Elias Thorn, stood paralyzed on a wooden scaffold 6 stories above West 23rd Street. He wasn't an architect. He was a master stonemason, built like the very brownstone he scorned. In his hand, a thick, brass-bound ledger lay open, its pages stained by brick dust and sweat. Below him, the street was a chaos of horse-drawn trolleys and shouting vendors, but Elias's attention was fixed on the fire gutting the New Chelsea Savings Bank across the avenue. "Look at it, Michael," Elias grunted, the words tight in his throat, addressing his apprentice, a wiry Irish immigrant half his age. 6 stories of fireproof cast-iron facade melting like cheap tallow. That's your modernity, boy, a damned lie. The cast-iron front, a fashionable hallmark of the post-Civil War commercial boom, was peeling away from the masonry like burnt skin, exposing the hollow wooden skeleton beneath. The fire had started in the dry goods store on the ground floor, but the iron, meant to be a shield, had conducted the heat inward, turning the entire structure into a chimney. This paradox, the supposed triumph of new technology leading to spectacular, lethal failure, was the secret roaring engine of New York's next great transformation. The weight of brownstone. To understand the skyscraper, you must first understand the brownstone. It was the DNA of 19th century New York, a low, solid, predictable world that Elias Thorn understood in his bones. Elias had inherited his father's masonry yard and his father's philosophy. Mass equals permanence. For generations, his family had quarried the sandstone, actually a reddish-brown, iron-rich rock, from the Jersey cliffs and dressed it for the elegant, uniform rows that defined Greenwich Village, Harlem, and the Upper East Side. These homes were more than just buildings. They were the physical manifestation of the city's post-colonial ambition. They were heavy, load-bearing architecture. Every floor, every wall was supported by the material directly beneath it. "You can only stack a wall so high, Michael," Elias would lecture, as he pointed to the thick, 6-foot-deep foundations they were laying. "The higher you go, the wider the base must be. Go 10 stories, and the walls on the ground floor must be 3 feet thick. They swallow the light and the usable space. The brownstone stops us. It is our ceiling." By 1880, New York was suffocating under the weight of its own success. The city, particularly Manhattan, was experiencing an explosion in population and capital. Wall Street needed offices, merchants needed warehouses, and the new middle class needed housing. But the only way to build was out, across the island, not up. A building taller than 5 or 6 stories was a monumental waste of space and material, a dark, laborious climb that few men and no sensible woman would undertake without absolute necessity. The brownstone ceiling was firmly in place. The ascent of iron and steel. The city's first attempt to break that ceiling wasn't the elevator. In 1857, a man named Elisha Otis installed his first working safety elevator in a 5-story building on Broadway. Crucially, he did it with theatrical flair, ascending in a demonstration cage only to have an axeman cut the support rope, proving his patented safety brake would prevent the inevitable fall. The crowd gasped. The elevator operator, saved from death, proved that the air rights, the space above the brownstone ceiling, were now commercially viable. But the elevator solved the travel problem, not the construction problem. Cast iron, despite its failure at the Chelsea Savings Bank, was the next step. Builders loved it because you could mold it into decorative facades quickly and cheaply, far faster than dressing solid stone. It allowed for slightly larger windows and a bit more height, but it was structurally brittle, and, as Elias saw, a death trap in a fire. The real revolution began not on a street corner, but in the pages of technical journals and, ironically, in the massive industrial sheds of the Midwest. In Chicago, architects like William LeBaron Jenney were experimenting with something audacious, replacing load-bearing walls with a skeleton frame of structural steel. Steel was not a new material, but the Bessemer process and later the open hearth method had finally made it cheap enough and available enough for construction. It was strong, flexible, and crucially, non-combustible. A steel frame carried its own weight, meaning the exterior walls didn't have to be thick, dark, or load-bearing at all. They could be thin, curtain-like screens of glass and light. The weight of the building was no longer on the brownstone foundation, but on the metal cage within. The birth of the skyscraper war. Elias Thorn, the proud master mason, first heard the term skyscraper in 1890, spat out by a young engineer from Chicago who came east looking for investors. "We don't call them that, sir," Elias scoffed, pointing to the solid stone cornice he was setting. "We call them tall buildings, and yours will fall over." "It's not a building, Mr. Thorn," the engineer corrected, a thin smile on his face. "It's a machine, a vertical filing cabinet for workers." But the numbers didn't lie. Land prices in lower Manhattan had become astronomical. A square foot of property near the financial district cost more than a small farm upstate. The only economically sane way to proceed was to maximize the usable space. The race began. It wasn't about beauty. It was about height, speed, and profit. In 1890, the New York World Building, designed by architect George B. Post, broke the barrier. At 309 feet, it was briefly the tallest office building in the world, crowned with a grand copper dome. New Yorkers gawked, convinced the structure was an arrogant declaration against the laws of God and nature. Elias Thorn felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he watched the steel girders rise, stark and skeleton against the sky. His life's work, the patient, solid, immutable craft of stone on stone, was becoming obsolete, replaced by rivets, beams, and an economic imperative that refused to be contained. He looked at his ledger, his accounts detailing the supply of brownstone for the final grand rows of houses being finished near Central Park. He knew they were the end of an era. The city was done looking down, done with the weight of the past. It was looking up. But the engineer's sneer came back to him. "It's a machine." And Elias, the stonemason, vowed he would understand that machine, or he would be crushed beneath the shadow of its ascent. The war for the sky had just begun, and the brownstone man was about to face the Steel Age.
Our American historical epic, From Brownstones to Skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution, following Elias Thorn as he confronts the dawning Steel Age. This part continues the narrative, focusing on the technological and social shifts of the 1890s. Part 2. The Vertical Grid. The year is 1892. Elias Thorn, master stonemason, stood on a desolate stretch of land in what would one day be the meatpacking district. His boots crunched on frozen mud, not the soft, comforting powder of brownstone dust he was used to. He was here to inspect a Bessemer steel beam, a piece of the future that felt entirely alien. The beam, a massive, gleaming, eye-shaped girder, was being delivered for the skeleton of the new Manhattan Life Insurance Building, an audacious structure planned to be 20 stories tall. "Feel the weight of it, Elias," instructed Silas Finch, a young, irritatingly enthusiastic structural engineer who wore a perpetually smudged color. Silas represented everything Elias mistrusted: theory over tradition, calculation over craftsmanship. Elias ran a gloved hand over the cold metal. It felt unnervingly light for its strength. "It feels hollow, boy. Brittle." "It's not brittle, it's elastic," he corrected, tapping the beam with a blueprint tube. "A brownstone wall carries weight straight down, from stone to stone. This steel frame carries the load across the entire grid. Each floor, each column, works together. It's a cage, not a stack." This was the fundamental concept that horrified and fascinated Elias: the skeleton construction. In a brownstone, you built from the outside in. In a skyscraper, you built from the inside out. The exterior walls, the stone, the brick, the terracotta, were no longer the support. They were merely curtains, hanging, skin draped over a metal skeleton. The tyranny of the lot line. The shift from load-bearing stone to skeleton steel wasn't just a matter of engineering. It was a furious economic response to the tyranny of the Manhattan lot line. A typical commercial lot in Lower Manhattan might be a tight 25 by 100 feet. With traditional brownstone construction, the ground floor walls needed to be so thick to support 10 stories above that they consumed nearly 20% of the usable floor space, eating away at the rental income. The steel frame changed the equation entirely. Since the weight was carried by interior columns, the outer walls could be dramatically thinned, freeing up precious square footage, perhaps an extra office per floor. This single advantage, a few extra feet of profitable space, multiplied by 20 or 30 stories, made the skyscraper not just possible, but inevitable. It was the most profitable machine ever invented for its size. "It's a machine that prints money, Mr. Thorn," Silas boasted. "It's a machine that covers up bad work," Elias retorted. "If the frame carries all the weight, what is the stone for? Just to look pretty?" "Exactly," he chirped. "Cladding, Mr. Thorn. It's protective, decorative, and fireproof. That's your trade now. Not supporting the world, but dressing it." The Great Fireproofing Panic. The memory of the Chelsea Savings Bank fire haunted every developer in the 1890s. While steel was non-combustible, intense heat, like the kind generated by burning office furniture, could cause the metal to soften and buckle, leading to catastrophic collapse. The solution, ironically, brought Elias back into the game, at least temporarily: fireproofing. Architects began enveloping the steel structure in protective, insulating layers of terracotta tile and concrete. Terracotta, a baked clay material, was lightweight, inexpensive, and highly resistant to heat. It became the unsung hero of the early skyscraper, wrapping every beam, floor joist, and column in a ceramic blanket. Elias, with his generational knowledge of stone and masonry, secured contracts to supply the fireproofing gangs with specialized, dense brick and mortar mixtures for the most vulnerable areas. It was a humiliating pivot, moving from master builder to specialized wrapper, but it kept his yard open and his crew employed. He watched the workers, often Italian and Eastern European immigrants, move with terrifying speed. They were sitting steel rivets with pneumatic hammers, then quickly encasing the joints in fireproofing. The construction site was a dizzying, dangerous ballet of new technologies. The battle for height, aesthetics, and anxiety. As the buildings grew taller, an architectural and psychological crisis gripped New York. The early skyscrapers were often a hybrid nightmare. Architects, trained in classical Greek and Roman styles, which were built on massive stone foundations, tried to paste traditional architectural ornamentation, columns, cornices, domes, onto the vertical steel cage. The result was often jarring. A classical temple stretched thin, a Renaissance facade stacked 20 times high. They looked top-heavy, ridiculous, and unnatural. This was the heart of the anxiety. The scale of man was being replaced by the scale of commerce. "We are building monuments to greed, not to God," complained a popular newspaper editorial in 1895. The tall buildings blocked the sunlight, cast massive chilling shadows across the streets, and made the brownstone world feel tiny and insignificant. Elias saw it in his own neighborhood. The elegant, four-story brownstones he had built were suddenly dwarfed by the looming blocky presence of a garment factory that had gone vertical. The streetscape was being torn apart, piece by piece. He found himself standing on a corner, looking up at the American Surety Building, then the city's second tallest building at 312 feet. He didn't see an architectural triumph. He saw a challenge. "You dress the steel, Mr. Thorn," the engineer Silas had taunted him. "You are the tailor to the machine." But as Elias stared at the Surety building's facade, an idea sparked. If the stone was merely cladding, then it was no longer constrained by supporting the weight. The exterior could be thinner, lighter, and could be carved to emphasize the verticality of the steel frame underneath, rather than try to hide it underneath horizontal layers of classical decoration. The mason could still find a voice in the age of the machine. Perhaps the stone didn't have to support the building. It could define it. The true innovation, he realized, wouldn't be in the steel, but in what was wrapped around it. Elias Thorn began to sketch, not a wall, but a skin. His war against the skyscraper was over. Now his education had begun.
Our American historical epic, From Brownstones to Skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution, detailing Elias Thorn's painful transition from master stonemason to modernist cladding expert in the early 1900s. Part 3. The Triumph of Thinness. It was 1902. The city was no longer just building tall, it was building slick. Elias Thorn's masonry yard, once a hive of covers shaping massive blocks of brownstone and limestone, was now dominated by stacks of delicate, glazed terracotta tiles and thin slabs of architectural brick. His apprentice, Michael, was now a foreman, but he still watched Elias with concern. The master mason looked defeated, standing before a stack of newly arrived white polished marble panels, stone so thin you could almost see through it. "This isn't stone, Michael," Elias muttered, running a skeptical finger over the cool surface. "It's a veneer, a mask. We are dressing this city like a stage actor." He was referring to the Flatiron Building, originally the Fuller Building, then under construction at the intersection of 5th Avenue, Broadway, and 23rd Street. Its design was a radical departure. Unlike the previous hybrid structures, the Flatiron embraced its verticality and its steel skeleton. Its exterior was a mosaic of terracotta and limestone, all designed to emphasize the building's soaring triangular shape. The curtain wall revolution. The Flatiron was the first widely celebrated structure to fully implement the concept of the curtain wall. A curtain wall is simply a non-load-bearing outer covering that keeps the weather out. Since the steel frame carried all the weight, the exterior could be lighter, thinner, and covered with vast expanses of glass. Elias had secured a small but lucrative contract to work on a section of the Flatiron's lower facade, installing carved limestone panels that framed the ground floor retail windows. He was working under architect Daniel Burnham, a Chicago giant, whose designs were based on efficiency and monumentality. Burnham's approach demanded precision Elias never needed before. When laying a traditional brownstone wall, slight variations could be hidden in the thick mortar. With the curtain wall, every panel of stone or terracotta had to fit the steel grid with meticulous accuracy. "The stone is no longer the structure, it is the tolerance," Silas Finch, the young engineer, now a supervisor, explained one blistering July morning. "The steel expands in the heat, contracts in the cold. The stone must move with it. If your mortar is too rigid, the whole wall will crack." Elias had to retrain his crew. They learned to work with anchor bolts, expansion joints, and metal tiebacks, small pieces of the steel framework hidden within the stone to literally hook the stone to the building. The craft of masonry was no longer about brute strength and gravity. It was about precise measurements and flexible attachment. The aesthetics of verticality. As Elias worked on the Flatiron, he began to see the logic of the new aesthetic. Earlier tall buildings often looked like wedding cakes, horizontal layers of decoration piled on top of each other, trying to disguise the height. Burnham's design and the emerging style of New York architecture consciously drew the eye upward. The window bays were organized in groups of 3 running unbroken for several stories, separated by thin, vertical piers of limestone. This trick, known as the tripartite division, a base, a middle shaft, and a crowning capital, visually elongated the building, turning a massive structure into an elegant soaring spire. Elias looked at the finished structure from Madison Square Park. It wasn't just a building, it was a sculpture that commanded the intersection. It proved that architecture didn't have to sacrifice beauty for height, but that height was the new beauty. The unseen crisis, foundations. While the upper reaches of the buildings were a display of steel and glass, the true hidden battle of the skyscraper was waged deep underground, the foundations. Manhattan is an island of complex geology. Below the soft soil and glacial till, the island has a spine of solid, load-bearing schist bedrock. In the shallow areas of Midtown and Downtown, engineers could relatively easily dig down and set steel columns directly onto the rock. But in other areas, the bedrock plunged hundreds of feet deep, replaced by unstable, watery clay and sand. Building a 20-story structure on soft ground was a recipe for disaster. This led to the intense, dangerous work of pneumatic caissons. Elias's yard briefly became a supply point for the sand and cement needed for caisson work. He learned of the terrible conditions. Massive steel or concrete cylinders were sunk deep into the earth. Workers called sand hogs would enter the compressed air chamber at the bottom of the caisson to dig out the soil, pushing back the water and mud with high air pressure. This compression was necessary to keep the chamber from flooding, but it led to the agonizing condition known as the bends, decompression sickness, as the workers returned to the surface. It was a terrifying trade-off, a few feet of solid footing for a lifetime of pain or even immediate death. The cost of the skyline was paid first in the lives of the men underground. Elias realized the true difference between his brownstone era and the Steel Age. His buildings rested gently on the earth. The skyscrapers had to be drilled, bolted, and forced into the very bedrock, often by men who sacrificed their health to do it. The city's vertical ambition was rooted in a brutal subterranean war. As Elias watched the Flatiron rise, beautiful and imposing, he felt two conflicting truths: that the stone he applied was merely an expensive, aesthetic shroud, and that the men beneath the earth were the true, invisible foundation of New York's new magnificence. He was now a participant in this new world, his hands skilled in the past, but his eyes fixed on the impossible heights of the future. The next phase of the competition would be even more daring, pushing not only the height, but the very shape of the skyline.
Of our American historical epic, From Brownstones to Skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution. This segment details the intense race for height in the first decade of the 20th century, culminating in the construction of the Metropolitan Life Tower and Elias Thorn's evolving role. Part 4. The Race for the Spire. The year is 1909. New York City was gripped by what journalists dubbed altitude mania. It was a furious, almost theatrical contest between powerful corporations to build the world's tallest structure, a concrete and steel declaration of financial supremacy. Elias Thorn, now in his late 50s, stood on the rooftop of his old brownstone on the Upper West Side, squinting through a pair of field glasses. He wasn't looking at the street, he was looking south, toward the dazzling new Singer Building. Completed in 1908, the Singer Building, at 612 feet and 47 stories, was briefly the world's tallest. Its design was sleek, narrow, and capped with a distinctive dome. It was a victory for French Beaux Art influence and a testament to the fact that height was no longer a side effect of commerce, but an intentional architectural goal. The new king, the MetLife Tower. The reign of the Singer Building was short-lived. Just a year later, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company Tower, MetLife Tower, rose above Madison Square. It was not a blocky office building. It was an architectural stunt, a literal copy of the Campanile in Venice, Italy, stretched to an astonishing 700 feet. The tower held the title of the world's tallest building until 1913.
Its construction marked a shift in architectural philosophy. The skyscraper was no longer just a frame, it was a monument. It wasn't built for maximum floor space, but for maximum visual impact and branding. The MetLife company wanted the entire city to know where its money was. Elias, who had a small contract providing specialized fire flashing and custom terracotta cornice work for the lower annex, studied the massive structure. "It's beautiful, isn't it, Master?" Michael, his foreman, asked. "It's a lie, Michael," Elias corrected, though his voice lacked its former bitterness. "It's a tower, not a building. The tower itself holds no offices. It's just a clock and a beacon. It's a 700-foot advertisement." But it was a spectacular advertisement. The tower's exterior was covered in dazzling white marble and terracotta, a brilliant counterpoint to the city's darker limestone and granite. At night, it was lit by powerful floodlights, a luminous sentinel in a world of gaslight. It was the first time a skyscraper was consciously designed to be a symbol of the city itself. A new material, the white city look. The dominant external material for these new giants was white architectural terracotta. This material was a direct legacy of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the White City, where architects discovered that terracotta could be molded to imitate expensive stone carvings and then glazed to be bright, reflective, and impervious to the city's thick coal smoke. For Elias the mason, this was another adaptation. Terracotta was molded by ceramicists, not carved by stoneworkers. He had to learn to respect the modular nature of the tile. A mason no longer laid bricks. He installed pre-fired, numbered pieces of a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, each one designed to hook precisely onto the steel frame. He also had to teach his men the absolute criticality of waterproofing. Stone absorbed water slowly, but the terracotta curtain wall, with its numerous joints and thinness, was vulnerable. If water breached the outer shell, it could freeze and crack the tiles, or worse, corrode the unseen steel skeleton beneath. Their work was now less about brute strength and more about meticulous sealing and flashing. The iron law of zoning. The MetLife Tower, the Singer Building, and others like them cast enormous shadows. Their rapid, unchecked growth led to a major social and legislative backlash. In 1907, an editorial in the New York Tribune warned that Manhattan would soon become a sunless canyon, condemning the public health consequences of blocked light and air. Property owners buildedly complained that the new giants were devaluing their adjacent low-rise buildings by plunging them into perpetual shadow. This public outcry led to, in 1916, the landmark New York City Zoning Resolution. The 1916 zoning law was a watershed moment. It didn't prohibit tall buildings, but it regulated their shape. Specifically, it required that a building must set back from the street as it rose. After reaching a certain height, the walls had to recede at a specific angle, ensuring that light and air reached the street level. Elias, who had a small contract providing specialized fire flashing and custom terracotta cornice work for the lower annex, studied the massive structure. The stonemason, who once built solid boxes, now realized that the city was mandating a whole new design aesthetic based on the movement of the sun. The law of the land had become the law of architecture. Elias Thorn, the brownstone man, smiled for the first time in years. The setback law meant that the top of the building, the spire and the crown, would be more complex and detailed than ever before. It meant that the final delicate carving and cladding work would be absolutely vital to the building's identity. The machine of steel still ruled, but now the artistry of the cladding had been given a new, complex canvas upon which to paint the sky.
Of our American historical epic, from brownstones to skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution.
This segment focuses on the dramatic architectural and economic effects of the 1916 zoning law, which led to the creation of the distinct setback New York skyline. Part 5. The Wedding Cake City. The year is 1923. The Great War was over, the economy was roaring into the Jazz Age, and the 1916 zoning resolution had begun to fully reshape Manhattan. The city was no longer building simple vertical shafts, it was building stepped, complex monuments, the wedding cake, or ziggurat style. Elias Thorn, now a consultant and specialized cladding contractor, had his crew installing the intricate terracotta cornice work on the new Standard Oil building at 26 Broadway. This building was a prime example of the new architecture, a classical base, an octagonal main tower, and required setbacks that gave it a sculpted, almost mountainous profile. "The law forces the light," Elias told Michael, now a partner in the firm, as they reviewed the blueprints. "But the setback doesn't just let the sun in, it creates a canvas for the wind and the rain. Everything above the street level is exposed, and every angle must be perfect." The new geometry of ascent. The 1916 law was fundamentally a legal constraint that birthed a new aesthetic. Architects couldn't just build a square box straight up. They had to follow the sky exposure plane, an invisible line sloping inward from the street. This forced architects like Cass Gilbert, designer of the Woolworth Building, and Raymond Hood to become masters of volume and light. Instead of one monolithic block, the skyscraper became a series of interlocking masses, each step or setback creating an opportunity for decorative work. For masons, this meant an explosion of complex, high-altitude work. The setbacks created multiple exposed roofs and terraces that needed intensive waterproofing, drainage systems, and specialized stone cladding that could handle horizontal as well as vertical stresses. Elias's crew specialized in setting the complex, pre-molded terracotta parapets and copings, the protective caps on the edges of the roofs that often mimicked ancient stonework despite being made of modern ceramic. The irony was not lost on Elias. He had spent his life building flat, solid walls. Now his firm made its living cladding structures designed to be jagged and recessed, defined by the law that protected the light he himself once took for granted. The economic engine, rentable views. The setbacks were not just about compliance. They quickly became a feature that drove up rental prices. The terraces created by the steps offered phenomenal views and were highly sought after. A corner office on the 20th floor that featured a private wraparound terrace commanded a rental premium that far exceeded the cost of the lost interior space from the required setback. The building was literally selling slices of the Manhattan view and the open air. The city's architecture had monetized the sky. Elias often visited the construction sites, riding the terrifying open-air hoists up the side of the steel skeleton. From the 30th floor of the Standard Oil building, the view was overwhelming. The brownstones of the past were reduced to neat brown blocks below, and the winding geometry of the new buildings, carved by the 1916 law, stretched toward the horizon. "It's a beautiful machine, Michael," Elias conceded, looking down the canyon of Broadway. "A machine for seeing and a machine for selling. We are just the artisans who polish the brass." The rise of Art Deco and the new stone. As the 1920s boomed, the traditional classical ornamentation, seen on the Woolworth Building, gave way to the sharp, streamlined aesthetic of Art Deco. The material of choice shifted again. While terracotta remained popular for its affordability and moldability, the wealthy buildings began to demand the cool, gray majesty of Indiana limestone and granite. These stones offered a sleek, flat surface that perfectly complemented the geometric lines of the Art Deco style. Elias found his trade returning to its roots with a crucial difference. The stone was thinner, cut with diamond-tipped saws, and was attached with more metal anchors than mortar. The mason's hammer and chisel were replaced by the drill and the bolt. His greatest challenge was training his crew to handle the massive, heavy panels of stone in the air. The derricks and cranes lifted the stone to the correct height, but setting the massive slabs against the steel frame required precision, teamwork, and absolute trust in the new mechanical aids. He watched his men, mostly second-generation Italian and Irish immigrants, suspended hundreds of feet in the air on simple scaffolding, bolting a 10-foot slab of polished granite onto a setback corner. They were doing the work of heroes for the price of laborers, and every day the wind reminded them of the peril. Elias, the man who scorned the machine, was now entirely dependent on it, from the crane that lifted his stone to the elevator that carried him to work. He understood that New York's evolution was not just architectural. It was a profound, dangerous, and often glorious negotiation between gravity, steel, and light. The stage was set for the final, ultimate showdown in the race for height, a competition that would define the entire century. The year is 1929. The air in lower Manhattan didn't just smell of coal smoke and river silt anymore. It smelled of sheer, audacious ambition. Three commercial behemoths, Walter Chrysler, the automobile mogul, the Bank of Manhattan Trust Company, and John J. Raskob, the former vice president of General Motors, were locked in a ruthless, secret war to possess the title of the world's tallest building. This wasn't just a business move, it was a testament to the ego and financial swagger of the Jazz Age. Elias Thorn, now nearing 60, and his firm were deep in the thick of it, cladding the lower floors of the Bank of Manhattan Trust Building at 40 Wall Street. "They are building for bragging rights, not for renters, Michael," Elias grumbled to his partner as they oversaw the installation of massive decorative granite panels. The building was designed to be 840 feet tall, which would have easily beaten the current record holder, the Woolworth Building. Then, the rumors started. The Chrysler surprise. Walter Chrysler, a man obsessed with outdoing his rivals, had watched the 40 Wall Street progress with disdain. His own building, the Chrysler Building at 42nd and Lexington, was originally designed to be a modest 925 feet. But Chrysler and his architect, William Van Allen, had a secret weapon. The plans for the Chrysler Building's height were suddenly revised. Van Allen was instructed to design a secret, retractable structure that would not be publicly announced until the Bank of Manhattan was nearly finished. The secret was a 77-ton stainless steel spire designed to be erected atop the building's crown. In the summer of 1929, as the Bank of Manhattan was celebrating topping out at 927 feet, securing the world's tallest title for a few dizzying weeks, the Chrysler team executed their final and dramatic move. They hoisted the massive spire, piece by piece, through the building's core, where it lay hidden. Then, in a single, secret, 90-minute operation, the spire was raised through the roof and bolted into place. The Chrysler Building now stood at 1,046 feet. It was a breathtaking, literal surprise attack, making the Bank of Manhattan obsolete before it even opened its doors. The tower was not merely a building, it was an artistic monument to American industrial design, complete with stainless steel gargoyles and geometric motifs mirroring Chrysler car hubcaps. The rise of the Empire State. The sheer arrogance of the Chrysler victory immediately provoked a much larger, more ambitious counterstrike from John J. Raskob and his partners. Raskob's mandate to his architect, William F. Lamb, was simple and absolute. "I want it to be the tallest in the world by a considerable margin." The result was the Empire State Building. Raskob's project was not a contest of art, but a contest of speed and efficiency.
The goal was to build the tower faster than anyone thought possible, to secure the title before another rival could emerge. Elias Thorn's firm was contracted for all the exterior stone cladding on the lower sections of the Empire State Building. The scale was overwhelming. The facade required 10 million bricks and 730 tons of Indiana limestone and granite. The speed of construction was miraculous. The entire steel frame rose at a rate of about 4.5 stories per week. Elias watched the steelworkers, the skyboys, mostly Mohawk ironworkers, move with terrifying, balletic grace on the narrow beams, hundreds of feet in the air, without safety nets. They set rivets with deafening bursts of pneumatic hammers, building the skeleton of the future. The efficiency was a result of perfect organization. Materials flowed up the spine of the building on a precise, non-stop schedule, a genuine vertical assembly line. Elias's masons had to keep pace with the steelworkers, often just a few floors below the riveting crews. They were hanging the limestone cladding, piece by piece, anchoring it into the steel skeleton, turning the functional steel cage into a majestic, solid-looking stone monolith. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed. The competition suddenly felt absurd, a reckless indulgence of a financial age that had just collapsed. Construction on the Empire State Building, however, did not stop. Raskob and his investors understood that halting the project would be a greater financial disaster than continuing it. The Empire State Building finally topped out at an impossible 1,250 feet in 1931. It secured the title by an emphatic margin, but it was built for a world that no longer existed. It opened during the depths of the Great Depression. To justify the tremendous height, Raskob initially planned a blimp docking station at the very top. This was quickly revealed to be utterly impractical due to the ferocious winds at that altitude, but it provided a fantastical, aspirational finish to the monumental structure. Elias stood on Fifth Avenue on the day the Empire State Building officially opened. He looked up the sheer, uninterrupted height of the limestone facade, past the setback tiers, past the Art Deco crown, to the mooring mast that pierced the clouds. It was a monument to human genius, built through incredible efficiency, but it was also a tombstone for an entire era of unchecked financial confidence. The Brownstone man had lived to see the impossible, a structure that was nearly 3 times the height of the stone buildings of his youth. The war for the sky was over. New York had peaked, and the Great Depression ensured that it would be a very long time before anyone dared to challenge the new king of the city. Of our American historical epic, From Brownstones to Skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution. This segment covers the challenging Depression years, the shift from stone to less expensive industrial materials, and the crisis facing Elias Thorn's firm. Part 7. The Era of Emptiness. The year is 1933. The roar of the Jazz Age was replaced by the silence of the Great Depression. The Empire State Building, the undisputed king of the skyscrapers, was sardonically nicknamed the Empty State Building. Its vast office spaces sat vacant, and the building's operators often turned off the lights on entire unused floors to save money. The vertical city, built on a foundation of speculative wealth, now stood as a grand, mocking symbol of financial ruin. Elias Thorn, in his early 60s, saw his once thriving cladding firm shrink to a skeleton crew. Orders for ornate limestone and custom terracotta dried up entirely. His yard, once filled with the resonant clang of chisels and hammers, was quiet. "They're not building, Michael," Elias stated simply, looking out at the dusty yard. "And if they are not using us, not for stone." The new austerity, steel and glass. The economic paralysis forced architects and developers to abandon the opulent stone and elaborate terracotta facades of the 1920s. Construction was still necessary, but cost-cutting became the ultimate design principle. This ushered in the era of modernism in American architecture, defined by clean lines, functionalism, and industrial materials. The new materials of the Depression were cheap, available, and honest about their industrial origin: brick, concrete, and most revolutionary of all, large sheets of glass and aluminum. The architecture of the 1930s favored the skin and bones look, the visual expression of the steel skeleton underneath, unadorned by classical or Art Deco dressing. This was architecture stripped bare. For Elias, this shift was the ultimate threat to his trade. Modernism had no need for the master stonemason. They want metal and glass. They want factory-made skin. They're designing buildings that look like refrigerators. Rockefeller Center, the monument of survival. The one monumental exception to the universal stillness was Rockefeller Center, a massive, privately funded complex that began construction in 1931. It was an astonishing act of faith and a crucial source of employment for thousands of skilled tradesmen, including Elias's masons. Rockefeller Center was a turning point. It wasn't built for record height. It was built for urban design and cohesion. It was a massive, low-slung, unified complex of buildings that followed the 1916 setback law beautifully, creating open plazas and public spaces. Elias's firm secured a contract on the RCA building, now the Comcast building, the center's crown jewel. The facade was constructed almost entirely of smooth, buff-colored Indiana limestone, but it was used not for intricate carvings, but for vast, flat plains, a modernist application of a traditional material. Elias's men had to learn a new discipline: perfection in simplicity. Laying perfectly flat, large limestone panels with minimal mortar joints was far more demanding than applying ornate, busy carvings that could hide imperfections. The flat geometry demanded no tolerance for error. "The machine demands perfection, Michael. No room for the soul in this stone," Elias noted, though he was quietly proud of the clean, soaring lines of the building. The RCA building stood as a powerful example of how stone could adapt, but it was an exception. Most new, smaller commercial buildings used cheap red brick and simple steel window frames, a complete regression from the grandeur of the 1920s. The death of ornamentation. The Depression years completed the shift that the steel frame had begun. The separation of the structural engineer from the architectural decorator. In the past, the mason was the structural engineer, the architect, and the decorator, all in one. Now the structural engineer designed the steel cage, and the architect, if they had a budget at all, decided on a thin, inexpensive skin. Elias realized that the ornamentation that defined the brownstone and the Art Deco skyscraper, the gargoyles, the cornices, the detailed window surrounds, was gone forever, deemed too expensive, and, by the rising generation of modernist architects, too sentimental. One cold afternoon, Elias supervised the salvage of some ornate terracotta panels from a small office building being demolished near Wall Street, a pre-Depression relic that couldn't cover its taxes. He ran his hand over the molded clay, a pattern of geometric eagles that symbolized the very financial ambition that had just failed. "We used to build the character of the city, Michael," Elias sighed, gesturing at the pile of debris. "Now we just skin the outside of the vault." But as he looked at the massive, clean lines of the RCA building across the city, he saw a glimmer of hope. Even in the age of austerity, the city still needed a skin, a durable, elegant shield against the elements. If his firm couldn't build the foundation anymore, they would have to become the undisputed masters of the surface. The next phase of New York's evolution would not be about height, but about the material used to enclose it.
Of our American historical epic, From Brownstones to Skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution. This segment leaps into the post-World War II era, where the traditional stone facade gives way entirely to the sleek international style of glass and aluminum. Part 8. The Glass Curtain. The year is 1952. New York was experiencing a second post-war boom. Unlike the frantic, ornate growth of the 1920s, this era was characterized by a cool, rational, and global architectural movement known as the International Style. Elias Thorn, in his late 60s, stood across from Park Avenue looking at the construction site of the Lever House. What he saw was the end of his world. The Lever House and the soon-to-be-completed United Nations headquarters were revolutionary. They were not built with stone, brick, or even traditional terracotta. Their facades were constructed almost entirely of glass and stainless steel, the curtain wall taken to its ultimate, literal conclusion. "They've done away with the skin altogether, Michael," Elias said, a quiet despair in his voice. "This is a building of light and air. No weight, no mass, no home for stone." The triumph of transparency. The international style, championed by European architects like Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, valued transparency, functionality, and the visible expression of the steel frame. The buildings were sleek, rectilinear boxes, often lifted off the ground by thin columns, pilotis, and covered in non-structural glass panels. The shocking feature was the absence of a street-level stone facade. Lever House stood on an open plaza, giving back valuable street space and light. The architecture was anti-ornamentation and anti-mass. For the first time, the outer wall of a skyscraper was assembled like a gigantic weatherproof window system. The masonry industry was virtually shut out. Elias's firm, which had survived the Depression by supplying simple limestone for Rockefeller Center, was now on the brink of collapse. The few new buildings being erected demanded that only the steel structure be clad in aluminum panels or thin glass units. "We're building the city with mirrors," Michael observed, rubbing his chin. "Every floor is just a reflection of the sky and the street. There is no texture, no story in the material." The sacrifice. Adapt or die. Elias knew the truth. The old ways were dead. His lifetime trade, the patient quarrying, the dressing, the carving, the meticulous laying of heavy stone was obsolete. The new aesthetic demanded speed, lightness, and precision assembly of factory-made components. He made the hardest decision of his life. He sold off most of his brownstone inventory and retired his last heavy stone cutting saw. He used the capital to acquire the equipment necessary to install the new aluminum and glass curtain walls, massive hydraulic rifts, sophisticated caulking guns, and specialized handling equipment for the large glass units. Thorn & Son Masonry became Thorn & Son Facade Contractors. Elias didn't hang the glass panels himself. That work was done by specialized iron workers and glaziers, but his firm became the essential bridge between the architect's vision and the finished wall. They specialized in the watertight integration of these modular systems into the steel structure, a role Elias recognized as simply a modern, industrialized form of his old fireproofing and waterproofing expertise. He learned the terminology of the new age: mullions, the vertical frames, spandrels, the opaque panels that hid the floor slabs, and the crucial science of thermal movement, how the glass and metal would expand and contract wildly with the temperature change, demanding flexible silicon sealants rather than rigid mortar. The Capital Eagle Tom era, the age of corporate standardization. The ultimate expression of this new style arrived with the Seagram Building in 1958, designed by Mies van der Rohe. It was an austere, dark bronze tower that was mathematically perfect and intentionally simple. It sat on a granite plaza, setting it back from the street. The building was sheathed in a skin of bronze and tinted glass, but Mies intentionally exposed the non-structural I-beams on the facade, running them vertically to emphasize the building's height and structural honesty. This building was not an ego project like the Chrysler Tower. It was a perfect example of corporate standardization and elegance. It was also incredibly expensive, proving that while modernism valued functional simplicity, it did not necessarily equal cheap construction. The Seagram Building stood as a cold, beautiful monument to the fact that the architecture of New York was no longer about local stone or individual artistry. It was about global corporate identity and the universal language of industrial materials. Elias, the man who once fought for the permanence of Brownstone, watched his grandsons take over the new firm, learning to hang sheets of glass on a cold steel frame. He had adapted, but he never truly loved the weightless, transparent city. As he stood near the Seagram Building, feeling the warmth radiating off the bronze frame on a cold day, he acknowledged the brilliance of the new design. It was beautiful, but it had no secrets. It showed all its bones. The old brownstones, heavy, closed, and dark, had always held a mystery within their walls. The glass tower held nothing but the reflection of its surroundings. The city was finally and completely exposed.
The year is 1970. The glass curtain wall, once a symbol of progress and clean corporate efficiency, had devolved into a symbol of monotony and soullessness. The New York skyline was a canyon of featureless, interchangeable glass and steel boxes. The city was tired of the sleek, functional simplicity of the international style. It longed for texture, warmth, and a connection to its history. Elias Thorn, now well into his 70s, had semi-retired, leaving the day-to-day operations of Thorn and Son facade contractors to Michael and his grandson, young Elias Jr. "They look like filing cabinets, Grandpa," Elias Jr. said, gesturing toward a new dark glass skyscraper rising near the World Trade Center site. No ornament, no cornice, nothing to say they belonged to New York. The reign of concrete and brutalism. In the 1960s and 70s, the dominant response to the glass box was brutalism, an architectural style characterized by exposed, unadorned concrete and a fortress-like emphasis on mass and structure. This was architecture attempting to regain the weight and solidity of the brownstone era, but with a modern, stark material. For Elias Sr., the brutalist era was a profound rejection of the gentle art of masonry. The rough, poured concrete facades of buildings like the Whitney Museum, though smaller, and various institutional structures were designed to look heavy, permanent, and often grim. They had no need for skilled cladding, only for formwork carpenters and concrete mixers. Meanwhile, the glass box architecture continued, driven by cost efficiency. The twin towers of the World Trade Center, completed in the early 70s, were the ultimate expression of the modernist ideal. Two massive, unadorned, repetitive aluminum-clad shafts that prioritized sheer volume and height over decorative artistry. They were engineering marvels, but they were criticized for being utterly sterile. The crisis of historical identity. The lack of architectural character led to a historic preservation movement. New Yorkers realized that in their rush to modernize, they were systematically destroying the very structures that gave the city its soul. The destruction of the magnificent Pennsylvania Station in 1963, a grand classical stone structure, to make way for the dreary Madison Square Garden and the new Penn Station complex, was the turning point. It proved that if the city didn't fight, its past would be paved over. This public outrage eventually led to the 1978 Supreme Court decision that upheld the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Suddenly, historical context mattered, and architects were forced to respect the existing cityscape. Postmodernism, the return to the past. The architectural rebellion against the glass box culminated in postmodernism in the late 1970s and 1980s. Postmodern architects sought to reintroduce ornamentation, color, and historical reference to the skyscraper. It was a conscious attempt to make skyscrapers look interesting and friendly again. This was a lifeline for the Thorn family firm. Elias Jr. was keenly aware of his grandfather's expertise. He began aggressively bidding for the cladding work on these new, expressive buildings. One notable commission was the AT&T building, now the Sony building, designed by Philip Johnson and John Berge, completed in 1984. This building was a sensation. It was a granite-clad skyscraper that included a massive 7-story Chippendale pediment, a stylistic reference to 18th century furniture, at the top, and a massive Romanesque arch at the base. It was theatrical, controversial, and completely broke the rules of modernism. The building required thousands of custom-cut pieces of pink granite. Elias Sr., though formerly retired, supervised the setting of the massive, curving pieces for the entrance arch. He was back to working with heavy, load-bearing size stone, even though the steel frame was carrying the weight. It was cladding disguised as structure, a final, beautiful irony. "They made the stone tell a story again, Michael," Elias Sr. said, watching the pink granite arch rise. "They're not afraid to tell a joke. They're not afraid of the past." The brownstone man had lived long enough to see the city's architecture return, in spirit, if not in form, to its core values: mass, ornament, and a connection to history.
Of our American historical epic, From Brownstones to Skyscrapers, a journey through New York's architectural evolution. This final segment brings the story into the 21st century, where technology allows for designs that synthesize the height of steel with the complexity and permanence of stone. Part 10. The Sculpted Sky. The year is 2018. New York's skyline was defined by a new generation of super-tall residential towers, skinny, impossibly tall structures that looked less like buildings and more like colossal, polished needles. These towers, built for the global ultra-wealthy, demanded facades that were technologically advanced, aesthetically complex, and financially spectacular. Elias Thorn Jr., now the patriarch of the Thorn facade contractors firm, watched his son and daughter, the fifth generation, using sophisticated computer programs to manage the installation of thousands of custom stone panels. The stone of choice was often Portuguese limestone or Italian marble, cladding materials that spoke of permanence and luxury. The digital masonry revolution. The key to the new architecture was computer-aided design, CAD, and building information modeling, BIM. These technologies reversed the trend of the past 80 years. They made customization cheaper than standardization. In the 1950s, a sheet of glass was cheaper than a carved stone panel because it was mass-produced. Now, a machine could cut a unique, curving custom stone panel with digital precision, making elaborate non-repetitive facades economically feasible. Elias Jr.'s firm was no longer just installing flat slabs. They were installing sculptural skins. They worked on luxury towers where the facade was not a straight vertical line, but a twisted, undulating, or faceted surface. Grandpa used to complain about the machine, Elias Jr. said to his daughter Maria as they reviewed the BIM model for a tower on Billionaires Row. But the computer is what brought the mason's art back to life. It gives the stone a perfect relationship to the steel frame. The stone, though still a curtain wall, was now cut with such exactitude that the joints were hair-thin, giving the illusion of a monolithic, sculptured mass, a spiritual return to the solid, heavy buildings of Elias Sr.'s youth. The architectural preference had shifted back toward mass, depth, and texture, a reaction against the cold, flat reflections of the international style. The new towers often utilized precast concrete panels inlaid with stone aggregates or thick slabs of granite and limestone that provided a sense of visual weight and permanence.
They drew inspiration from the Art Deco era, using setbacks and crowns, but executed with 21st century materials and technology. The Thorn firm specialized in anchoring these thick, heavy pieces using massive, custom-designed steel and aluminum brackets that allowed for the necessary thermal movement while ensuring the stone could withstand the ferocious wind load at extreme heights. The stonemason's challenge was no longer how to hide the thinness, but how to celebrate the new, digitally defined weight. The final paradox. The most profound paradox of the modern skyscraper was its height-to-width ratio. Due to advancements in elevator technology and structural damping systems to counteract sway, these new towers could be incredibly slender, often less than 60 feet wide for buildings over 1,000 feet tall. They were architectural impossibilities made real by engineering. Elias Sr., the brownstone man, had lived long enough to witness this final, incredible metamorphosis. He had seen the building materials change from brownstone, heavy, load-bearing, opaque, and low, to steel and terracotta, skeleton-framed, ornamented, moderately tall, to glass and aluminum, skeleton-framed, transparent, taller, to digitally sculpted stone, skeleton-framed, opaque, textured, super tall. The skyscraper had completed its journey. It had started as a simple heavy box and evolved into a light glass reflection, only to finally settle on a digitally sculpted synthesis, a structure that possessed the height and speed of the machine age, but was clad in the rich, durable materials of the earth. Elias Jr. often walked past the old brownstone rows in the West Village, structures built by his great-great-grandfather. He saw the narrow windows, the thick walls, and the beautiful, solid weight. Then he looked up at the smooth, twisting, marble-clad tower his family had helped build downtown. The stone was still there. It had simply climbed the wall. The journey from brownstones to skyscrapers was a testament not just to engineering, but to the stubborn human desire to keep a piece of the earth, a piece of mass and permanence with them, even when reaching for the sculpted sky. The story of New York's architectural evolution was the story of the material, the stone that refused to be forgotten.